like to actually introduce our next speaker. Back in 1980, few scientists believed that anything could be done to prevent the degenerative effects inflicted by aging. To counter this misconception, Mr. Bill Falloon pointed to then current scientific studies showing that it was possible to prevent some age-related diseases and to slow the aging process itself, at least in animals. He argued that if enough funds were committed to research, therapies to retard human aging could be developed that would result in the greatest revolution in medical history. Few people in 1980 thought that intervention into biological aging was possible, and many questioned why Bill Falloon would want to interfere with nature. But he argued that aging was the greatest scourge afflicting humanity, and that if people had the opportunity to live longer, many of society's problems would disappear. Now, Bill based his philosophical arguments on theories that people with limited lifespans are not particularly motivated to protect society's long-term interests, since they themselves have only a relatively short time to live. Longer lifespans, he asserted, would result in people behaving in a manner that would make the world a better place, since they themselves would have to exist in an environment that they create. So, without any further ado, let's all give a warm welcome to the founder of this church, Mr. Bill Falloon.
I'm going to thank Alex for those kind words. As most of you know, this church was established for the purpose of uniting like-minded individuals into an organization that teaches scientific rationality and will accelerate the Creator's plan for mankind to develop technologies that will facilitate the transformation of life into an environment of perpetual abundance. This particular service tonight is annual. It's very unique. It's called the Remembrance of the Resurrectables. These are people who have already been cryopreserved for the purpose of future reanimation. But what's interesting is that Nikolai Fedorov, he extended his expectation of mankind far beyond merely defeating disease, aging, and death for the living. He also mandated it was a duty, one of these common duties of mankind, to develop technologies that would result in the bodily resurrection of all humans who have ever lived. That's a pretty tall order. But what we're going to talk about tonight are some individuals who have done the impossible. As individuals, they've made accomplishments that enable us to exist today in a state of freedom that we enjoy. I don't know how many of you know a lot about Winston Churchill. What's unfortunate is they did a survey recently in England. Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of England during its most dire days of World War II, and the majority of people alive in England today were unable to recognize Winston Churchill's picture. They couldn't identify who Winston Churchill was. Well, what he was is the person who saved England from Nazi occupation. He saved the world, perhaps, without Churchill. And this is according to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal. Without Churchill, England would have suffered invasion and surrender to the Nazis, and it's unlikely that that would have been a reversible situation. So we want to pay a little bit of tribute to Winston Churchill and use him as an analogy to someone else we're going to memorialize later on during this service. But we cannot emphasize enough the power that an individual has in changing the world. And when you understand how individuals, singularly, on their own, have made such huge differences, it should empower each and every one of us to realize they can contribute in their own way to accelerating the Creator's plan for universal salvation. What I'm going to do is go to a little slide that I did last year that talked about how people historically viewed the past. They viewed it erroneously. They viewed it as a time of brightly lit rooms, as if lighting had always been around. But what we now know is, and what we've always known, of course, but people forget, is light electricity, all the conveniences we enjoy right now, for the most part of mankind's history, they just didn't exist. In fact, in the past, it really looked somewhat a lot darker. You could barely see the figures because candlelight just is not a very good way of disseminating light. And for most of the world, holiday festivities, well, they were nothing. They were dark black. The sun went down and you went to bed because there just was no electricity available to the masses or any form of light that was going to enable them to see anything. So what we'd like to talk about are other technologies that have accelerated in such a way that they're miraculous. These cell phones that we carry that can do more with their computer capacity than what mainframe computers did just 30 or 40 years ago. We talk about the accelerating returns because once this is applied to biology, we too are going to enjoy the benefits that the electrical technology now is giving other people. But when we go back in history, we learn that it's only been a recent phenomenon that we've had the availability of energy to produce the light and the power that we now all enjoy. Oil was not drilled out of the ground until the year 1859. Before that, people couldn't afford oil unless they were very wealthy. It was just too expensive. So most people lived in darkness. They lived without power. Everything had to be done manually because there just wasn't the energy available. And when Edwin Drake proposed that he could drill into the ground and pull out oil, he was ridiculed. That was considered to be an impossible feat. But he persevered. He persevered until he struck oil. And once he did, energy became very cheap for everybody. But of course, everything has a cycle. Cheap energy at some point became scarce energy. If we go back to 1973 with the Arab oil embargo, people had to line up for gasoline. And the experts back in 1973, they were predicting that around the year 2010, the world would run out of oil. This was a consensus of the geologists, the people with the expertise, using all of the data available with the proven and probable oil reserves. They projected we'd run out. The planet would once again become a dark place once the sun set. And there was no one disagreeing with that. Absolutely nobody. But interestingly, some people challenged that. One of those individuals, an individual named George Mitchell, in 1993, started to investigate technologies that would enable the removal of oil from the ground that was considered unrecoverable back in those days. And George Mitchell was another individual who was ridiculed. People didn't believe he could do what he set out to accomplish, but he nonetheless persevered. He developed methods to extract oil to the extent that at this date, this year, 2014, looking forward, there will probably never be a shortage of hydrocarbons on this planet. We will be able to pull out of the ground as much as we're going to need until better and cleaner technologies become available. But back in the 1970s, that was considered impossible. In fact, if you got a group of people together and ask them two implausible scenarios. Which implausible scenario would more likely occur? Scenario number one, will it be possible for cryopreserved human beings to ever be brought back to life? And we're talking about getting a room full of medical experts and other experts together asking that question. Or is it more plausible that we'll figure a way to pull unlimited amounts of hydrocarbons out of the ground? Which unlikely scenario is most likely to happen? Now, I believe the consensus, if that question were posed to several hundred of the most intelligent and enlightened individuals back in the 1970s, they'd say, well, we know the Earth only has so much in the way of hydrocarbon reserves. There's only so much oil that can be recovered. So it's probably more likely that they'll figure a way to revive those cryopreserved individuals than ever be able to pull unlimited amounts of hydrocarbons out of the ground. Well, guess what? They'd be wrong, because they are now pulling out so much oil, there's a surplus, And that surplus is going to continue to increase until this country will be exporting more oil than what it consumes. This chart, by the way, shows what happened when Edwin Drake, back in around 1859, started drilling for oil. There was virtually none coming out of the ground back then. It shot up to a very high level and then went down, went up a little bit with the Prudhoe Bay discovery and the Alaskan oil pipeline, and then it plummeted. And back around 2008, the world thought it was never going to be able to sustain itself with hydrocarbon energy. And then you see it shooting up. And that's going to continue to shoot up like a rocket because technology, impossible technology back in the 1970s to conceive of, it was developed. And the impossible has come true. We now have all the oil and all the natural gas we need. So we have a technology that was considered not able to occur. It did occur, and we believe some other technologies in the medical arena are also going to occur. But what we're here tonight is to do is to memorialize not only the one individual I'm going to talk about, but of course all of the individuals who are in a state of cryopreservation. We want to remember these individuals so that we continue to have the motivation to reanimate them. We're talking now about Jerry Leaf. His first life cycle was relatively short. He only lived 50 years, but in those 50 years, he accomplished so much. He transformed the practice of cryopreservation from that of a mortuary environment, which is what was done in the initial phases. He brought it into the medical arena. And in doing so, he brought other people, other medical professionals into the cryopreservation arena. And that has resulted in a dramatically accelerated pace of improvement in the way we cryopreserve individuals. We're no longer using an embalming machine to run glycerol through a patient and hoping we adequately perfuse them to protect against the cryopreservation damage, the low temperature damage. We're using much better technology. Jerry Leaf is the individual who made that happen. He was a thoracic research associate at UCLA Medical Center. He would teach young surgeons how to perform open heart surgery on animals. He would be the one to give them essentially their basic training before they ever put their hands on a human being. So his knowledge on vascular surgery was immense, but he had a greater knowledge or a greater need to expand on that knowledge. He wanted to figure out a way to cryopreserve people so that there would be little or no damage. And in doing so, he developed many of the technologies that we take for granted today in the cryonics field. But to give you an idea of what Jerry Leaf did, I want to show you, that's, by the way, the capsule bay of Alcor. Jerry Leaf is cryopreserved. He is in one of those capsules right now awaiting future reanimation. But what I want to show you is something that a lot of people might be surprised. Here's a picture of Jerry right now, 2 months before he died. And what he was doing there was helping the very first cryonics individual, Dr. Bedford, who was cryopreserved in 1967, to be transferred to the Alcor suspension bay. Dr. Bedford had set up a trust fund in 1967 to pay for his cryopreservation and long-term maintenance. But there were no cryonics organizations back then, and he didn't know how to set up the trust fund properly. The money ran out. Alcor, being a nonprofit organization, took on Dr. Bedford. He remains cryopreserved at Alcor and will remain there even though there was no funding available. This is a nonprofit initiative. We're not in this to make money. We're here to preserve life. And the best way to preserve life right now is through the cryopreservation process. Jerry Leaf was such a critical part of Alcor, such a critical part that the technology that Alcor has now is largely a result of Jerry Leaf's early work. This is the state of the art of technology when Jerry Leaf became known to me. I'm going to give a little personal message as to my first encounter with Jerry. I was at a cryonics conference back in 1978, and I ran into Jerry Leaf. And I didn't know him, he didn't know me, but I brought him out some pictures of what I had done in South Florida. I set up the first facility in the southeastern United States, as a matter of fact, to cryopreserve individuals. And I showed Jerry some of the photographs of my makeshift laboratory that I set up on my part-time. I worked full-time as an intern embalmer. This was my part-time work. And what we used back in those days was an embalming pump. We would run the circuit through a coil in this garbage bucket to cool down the liquid, and then the patient would go onto this table, and we would do a perfusion. But the perfusion we would do would be relatively primitive. We did have the glycerol and DMSO, we had all the chemicals, so we could do a mortuary-based cryopreservation technique. But I didn't know anything at all about real surgery, about the real medical profession. And Jerry Leaf, he spent an inordinate amount of time teaching me, drawing out diagrams and writing up exactly what I had to do to bring my laboratory up to the standards of his laboratory. And I was so impressed that he took his time to teach me what he already knew, what took him years to develop. He wanted to make sure that I understood that. He wanted to share his knowledge with me so that I could do a better job in Florida in cryopreserving individuals. Now that impressed me a lot, because so many people in this world, if they know something, they want to keep it to themselves. They want to make all the money themselves on it. They don't want to give it away. Jerry was not a kind of person who looked at money as something that was very important. He viewed science and progress in technology far more importantly than earning money. So my first encounter with Jerry, it was remarkable, having someone take the amount of time he did to teach me what I needed to do to bring my laboratory up to the standards of his laboratory. This is what Jerry Leaf would do when it came to cryopreservations. It was like open heart surgery. He practiced sterile technique. He introduced all kinds of innovations into the cryopreservation field that enable us now to cryopreserve, inflicting far less damage than what was done in those earlier days with the mortuary practice. And some of the technologies that Jerry developed made their way into the conventional medical field. There is a plasma extender drug called Hextend. It's owned by the Biotime company. It's used to help in surgical situations where a patient needs to extend their plasma so that they don't bleed to death. Jerry developed that for cryonics purposes, and it wound up being commercialized by another company. Jerry didn't make any money out of it at all. He just simply wanted to develop this to improve the technology of cryonics. Now that dog you see that Jerry's looking at, that dog at one point was clinically dead. Had no heartbeat, no respiration, no EEG. It was cooled to a very low temperature. And I worked on one of those experiments with a group of people that Jerry sent out here to Florida, a dog that looked very much like that. And we brought the dog's temperature down to about 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The dog was very cold, its muscles were very stiff. There was certainly no heartbeat, no respiration, and no EEG. And I really questioned whether or not that dog was ever going to come back. It appeared to me like many of the deceased individuals that would show up at my mortuary. It was, as far as I was concerned, dead. And we were calling Jerry and saying, we don't think this one's going to come back. It's not succeeding the way your experiments in Southern California work. And Jerry kept giving us instructions on different ways to get that dog back to life. And we were working different shifts, by the way, and after my shift was over, I went home and slept for 3 or 4 hours. And when I came back, I really didn't expect to see a living dog. Well, when I came back, that dog was up and running around and doing everything it did before we put it down. It had the same memory, it behaved the same way, and it was recovered. It was recovered from a period 4 or 5 hours before of being dead. Now that impressed me somewhat, but I already kind of figured that we could do this kind of technology or it would evolve, so I was less impressed than some of the novices that were there who couldn't imagine something that was that dead coming back to life. Now, it wasn't frozen, it was cooled. There is a difference. During freezing, there's some damage right now that we cannot yet recover. But as far as I was concerned with my experience, that dog was dead. But Jerry's perseverance, it was relentless. He kept saying, continue the CPR, continue the rewarming, put in some additional medications, and you might be able to get that dog back. And sure enough, that dog came back. We kept it as a pet, and again, there was no difference from before and after. Again, a flat EEG. There was no brainwave activity. There was no heartbeat, no respiration. The dog was in suspended animation. Now, Jerry did many of these experiments at his private lab in Southern California. And he would bring a lot of people from his UCLA medical team to come out and observe these experiments. And he would then be able to persuade a lot of medical professionals that cryonics had a basis in reality. Because here you had these dogs going down to these very low temperatures, being held at these very low temperatures, and then coming back to life on a routine basis. So that fascination that he was able to create enabled many medical professionals, or I should say motivated many medical professionals to take cryonics seriously for the first time. Because remember, before Jerry, this was a mortuary practice, so it didn't have a lot of credibility. But Jerry gave it that credibility. He was the bridge who took cryonics from a mortuary practice into a scientific medical practice. And that's what makes Jerry worthy of memorializing tonight. We're going to memorialize, of course, all of the individuals who are in cryopreservation. But Jerry, he was special. Very special. And my interactions with him, by the way, were very limited. There's people out there right now listening to me talk thinking, wow, there's so much more I could say about Jerry Leaf because I worked with him in Southern California for 7 to 10 years. And I was only privileged to work with Jerry on a very limited basis. When he would come to Florida, only a few times. And when I would go to California, only a few times. But my memory of him is very fond. And it wasn't just his technological prowess, his willingness to never give up. He was a pillar of strength within Alcor. He held the group together in a magical way, a way that made people feel we're doing something spectacular here. We're evolving this science, the way this church preaches for science to advance, to achieve universal salvation. It was happening with Jerry in a way that had never, ever been done before. And people would not hesitate to join Jerry on his weekend experiments, because Jerry worked Monday through Friday at UCLA. He spent his weekends doing dog experiments, and people were eager to participate because it was just an interesting adventure. We never knew how long we could keep these dogs down, how low their temperature would go, and still get them back. So it was a very interesting time in the era of cryonics research. Jerry, as I said, he's in cryopreservation at this stage, and he awaits our turn now, our turn to develop the technologies that will result in that universal salvation, which includes the bodily resurrection of all humans. Now, it's easy, relatively speaking, to imagine reviving cryopreserved individuals. You see it in the movies all the time. Of course, in reality, it's much more complicated. There's a lot of damage that occurs during the cryopreservation process. We minimize that damage with some of the vitrification technologies that we're using. However, we still need to advance technology much further in order to revive Jerry and all the other people you're going to see mentioned tonight. But the fact is, I was privileged enough to work with Jerry Leaf, and I feel honored that I'm able to describe just a few tidbits of the incredible journey Jerry made in cryonics, where he took it again from a very primitive state, a state that relied on a cooperative funeral director in order to make it happen. He brought it into the medical arena, where we now have dozens of medical doctors and PhDs who are signed up for cryonics. They participate in the research that we're doing now. At this stage, by the way, we have 4 labs on the west coast of the United States actively involved in improving vitrification technology. One laboratory is looking to perfect whole brain cryopreservation. Another group is looking at emergency response capabilities to improve those so we minimize any kind of ischemic damage. We have a number of spectacular research projects going on the west coast of California in laboratories that organizations I'm associated with own free and clear. So this research is going to continue on a perpetual basis. Back in the days of Jerry Leaf, he operated out of a very small industrial park bay. And Jerry would have been so proud to know how far the technology that he pioneered has advanced today. Going back to Churchill, the singular individual who saved Europe from Nazi occupation, the atrocities that would have occurred are beyond comprehension. But one individual stood up for a year and a half before the United States intervened. So we have to pay tribute to other great people who enable us to live with the freedom that we have today to perform the scientific work that needs to be done to achieve universal salvation. And in concluding, we want to talk about our prophet, Nikolai Fedorov. This man was a visionary who may have no equal. he did, as Alex mentioned, he predicted that technology could evolve to eradicate famine. And if anyone looks at a history of famine, that's what killed lots and lots of people for most of mankind's history. It was universal. If the crops didn't grow, if there was a blight, if there was any kind of natural disaster, people went hungry and or they starved to death. And Fedorov says this doesn't have to happen. Technology can evolve to eliminate this common cause of human suffering and death. And that technology has evolved. We have abundant food growing capacity. So much so that there's more food being grown right now than what can be consumed. And I know personally, by the way, I own some farms up in Georgia, and everything that was grown this year pretty much is not even being harvested because so much food has been grown in this country so far. Not too good news for the farmers, I know, but for the humanity, the idea that we can grow enough food to feed the world is a huge technological breakthrough. And it was predicted a little bit over 100 years ago that that would happen. And I'd like to predict that within 100 years, we're going to achieve some remarkable medical accomplishments. So I'm going to thank everyone for attending tonight. We're going to continue this service called the Remembrance of the Resurrectables. Again, we're remembering people who currently aren't able to participate in the good food we're going to enjoy downstairs, and the camaraderie. Those individuals are temporarily out of commission. They're in those capsules that I showed you there at Alcor and the Cryonics Institute, at Cryo-Rus in Russia. There are a number of other, by the way, cryonics facilities being set up, one in Australia, one in Oregon. This is expanding somewhat, but we're seeing more and more people accepting the idea that if we can't achieve perpetual existence today, we might as well take advantage of future technology. And that's what cryonics lets us do. And I've been signed up since I've been about 17 years of age. To me, it was just a rational decision. And I continue to be signed up, and my family is signed up, and many people I know have made arrangements for their bodies to be cryopreserved in the event we fail to achieve the universal salvation in our lifetime.
I want to actually thank all of our speakers. Bill, you're an inspiration to us all. Thank you for that. And so we're going to now go into the remembrance of the resurrectables. These are the people now currently cryopreserved.